This is Akashvani. In the program Spotlight, now we bring you a discussion on Civil 20 India Summit, Role of Civil Societies in G20. The participants are Professor Swarn Singh, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and Anubha Rohatgi, anchor.
The 3-day Civil 20 or C20 India Summit ended today in Jaipur, Rajasthan. The C20 is an official engagement group of the G20 representing the civil society organizations of the G20 member countries. To discuss the role of civil societies, we have with us Professor Swarn Singh of Jawaharlal Nehru University. Professor Singh, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me on your program today.
Professor Singh, the G20 is primarily a forum for international economic cooperation, even though over time we have seen that its scope has expanded to include issues like sustainable development, health, energy, and a lot more. So what is the significance of Civil 20 or C20, which represents the civil society organizations in G20?
As you mentioned, G20 has several formal engagement groups, which could include Business 20, Labour 20, Science 20, Think 20, Urban 20, Women 20, Youth 20, and of course, Civil 20, which represents civil society. It is part of the structure and therefore it has enough leeway to influence the decision making of G20 at large. Second, I think what makes it particularly interesting is that during India's presidency, C20 is supposed to have an unusual persona. Why I'm saying so? Because India is not just the largest population country or largest democracy. Civilizationally, India has had a very strong tradition of close connection of what we call civil society and the decision makers at all levels. And that has been integral part of India's political ethos. And that is why we saw that this time C20 has been the largest enterprise in G20's history so far. They have held about 1,000 plus meetings in 60 cities in India and abroad, engaging over 184,000 delegates from 74 nationalities. Now, this has never happened before. They have also added additional working groups other than the traditional issues like women empowerment and gender equality, etc. New areas like world is a family, Vasudhaiv Kutumbakam, or Seva, or lifestyle for environment. So, India being a very special example of a nation which had a very strong connect between civil society and decision makers, makes C20 an unusually influential element of G20, which has seen about 200 meetings of various groups over the last 8 months. And the fact that they have now come about with consensus, with a very voluminous recommendations, which is policy pack and the C20 communique, is a great example of how India has had strong credentials, known how to build consensus of a whole dispirited and diverse groups of nations and people together and still produce very, very solid recommendations at the end of it. So the scale, speed and the style of functioning of C20, I think, will be an example for the follow-up G20 meetings in coming years. And therefore, even if all of other engagement groups of G20 are very significant, they have been working hard overnight, over day, but C20, I think, in Indian case, would have a very special India imprint.
Professor Singh, what are the advantages of the civil society organizations over traditional government structures, which help these organizations impact official policies and programs and help the governments achieve holistic development?
Biggest advantage that civil society organizations offer is enormous flexibility. Because government institutions represent a very legal framework, which is institutionalized in a very subtle but in a very established format, which is not easy to maneuver around, sort of following up the things that are changing around us. Human environment is constantly changing and institutions very often find it difficult to evolve themselves, to gear up, to engage with novel issues and then new things around them. And civil society therefore able to step in and provide that cushion for the government institutions to work as a bridge to engage with issues and of course challenges that everyday people feel. And people can use these bridges to provide input to see that the challenges and the changing dynamics on the ground are well understood and represented in the policy making in official circles. So in that sense, that is a very critical connect that civil society has in empowering and engaging the government machineries over a period of time in multiple sectors. And that is why G20 has decided to have multiple engagement groups of this kind, including particularly the Civil 20, which specifically looks at civil society engagement, because that is very critical to understand where the world is going and in what direction the official structures need to move and develop innovative strategies and processes to address those challenges.
At the inaugural event, Raksha Mantri Rajnath Singh said that the CSOs can act as force multipliers for the government. Do you agree with this?
Definitely, because the more we empower our citizens, educate them, skill development is something that is brought to them, they become themselves very capable of doing several things that if they are not empowered and educated, they will depend on government machinery to deliver those things. Now, they don't just become partners in implementing various government schemes, but they also become advisors in that inputs that they provide in terms of improvising government policies and initiatives. So an enlightened civil society, therefore, definitely becomes a force multiplier for government to not just conceive of very, very effective and useful, inclusive, sustainable and holistic kind of approach to resolving challenges that they face, but also make it very effective in terms of implementing the decisions that government takes by partnering with civil society. So civil society, therefore, needs to be empowered so that they can be force multipliers for the government to deliver on their policies.
Talking about civil society, they work at various levels to bring about inclusiveness in the society. And when we talk about economic equality especially, we refer to inclusion of all the classes of society. So how do you view the role of civil societies in ensuring this inclusion?
Indeed, in C20, there are specific working groups which are dedicated to gender equality, dedicated to women empowerment. And again, when it comes to India, India's own approach to empowering women and girl children has been very, very well focused lately. There are campaigns to empower them, educate them. And that can be a kind of an example for several other countries in the G20 to see how a country where you have population of this large scale as India has still seeks to make that engagement possible, where women, which form half of society, must be empowered and allowed to participate not just in implementation but also in decision making at various levels. And in that sense, C20 definitely in their recommendations would have several recommendations to make how to move that momentum of that initiative further forward, accelerate that in ensuring that empowerment of women is done as effectively, as quickly, as efficiently, so that the total nation can benefit from that empowerment of half of civil society or half of society.
You've mentioned, of course, schemes for the betterment and for the inclusion of women. In India, government programs such as Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao and Swachh Bharat Abhiyan have been quite successful and have brought about social and behavioral changes at societal level. Though essentially these are government schemes, but how important has been the role of civil societies in their success?
Government invariably can only provide broad direction, can only facilitate, but it would require participation, at least equal participation of all of civil society to make those policies and initiatives successful. So state cannot actually go and clean my own house or clean my own neighborhood. And therefore, government can provide a broad direction. For example, in pandemic, they can provide vaccines, but it is nevertheless for civil society go and get vaccinated themselves. So it has to be complete participation of masses of civil society. And that is where civil society organizations provide the bridge or the leadership in building up that momentum in civil society, in ordinary people's lives, so that they understand and begin to participate in implementing those various government schemes. Now, government can create schools, but it is still for the families to send their young children to get educated in those schools. Therefore, I think empowerment of civil society itself remains a major focus of governments, because that makes task of government implementing policies relatively easier and more effective in that sense. So, civil society's partnership with the state is the key to achieving prosperity and peace for any nation.
At the conclusion of the Civil C20 India Summit, the policy recommendations that you talked about at the beginning of the discussion, these recommendations, which have been prepared by 16 working groups, are going to be handed over to the G20 Secretariat. Now, given that the primary role of C20 is policy recommendation, how challenging is it for the C20 to ensure that these are taken seriously by the G20 governments?
In fact, first time in G20 history, the policy pack and C20 communique are the most voluminous number of the recommendations that they have presented. So I believe that one can always point out to some recommendation that was not finally accepted at G20, but the kind of enormous work that C20 has done this time in engaging such a large number of people both in India and several other countries shows that they are most enthusiastic and they have been really working hard to produce their recommendations, and I'm sure large number of their recommendations will get accepted at G20 as well. But that is true of all various groups that will be giving their recommendations, that yes, 100% recommendations may not be finally accepted at G20 because they will be competing between what are the priority areas and how many issues are finally acceptable to the final communique of the joint statement that we might see from G20 summit meeting coming. But the fact that we are talking of G20 in India makes C20 unusually powerful and effective. And I think therefore, hope is that a large number of recommendations made by C20 will be acceptable to G20 summit meeting.
You've been expanding upon the role of India's presidency so far as the whole the G20 summit is concerned and what India is bringing to the table in this whole event. So do you think that India's presidency of G20 has given more voice to the CSOs, given our culture, our tradition, our importance on civil society?
I completely agree with what you said, because India is a country which is a continuing civilization with a very strong tradition of democracy, of people's engagement with decision makers. And therefore, civil society in India is unusually effective and alert of their rights and responsibilities. And the fact that G20 has this C20 as a formal engagement group gives them space to showcase that historical tradition of people constantly being watchdogs, but also partners of how state takes decisions and how the policies are implemented. And therefore, the enormity of the size of meetings, of the size of recommendations, of the footwork that these people have been doing for the last 8 months is unprecedented in that sense. And I think that is not going to be unnoticed by anyone, including the summit meeting leaders, and they would be aware of the kind of unusual contribution that India is making on civil society partnering with state and how together they can resolve the major challenges that the world is facing today.
Raksha Mantri Rajnath Singh in his inaugural event speech also called upon to nurture what he called the symbiotic relationship between the C20 and G20 on a sustained basis. How important is this in the present day context?
It's clearly a recognition from Raksha Mantri that there is something which is inbuilt and natural in Indian historical traditions. And how, when we talk of what would be India's imprint on G20 for future, just like world is one family is the focus of India's G20 presidency, is very quintessential Indian thinking. All Indian, for example, the ancient scriptures, they all talk of Manav, they talk of man, meaning human. And they don't talk of Indians or any specific region of India. So India's approach historically has been to look at entire world as one family, and therefore inclusiveness, holistic approach and kind of whole sustainability is inbuilt in Indian tradition itself. And I think that is very clear in the way all various groups of G20, including C20, has approached all various issues on which they are proposing their recommendations for the G20 summit. And I think in various groups, including C20 particularly, that India imprint is likely to be very visible.
Thank you so much for speaking with us, Professor Singh.
Thank you so much.
You are listening to a discussion on Civil 20 India Summit, Role of Civil Societies in G20. The participants were Professor Swarn Singh, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and Anubha Rohadke, Anchor. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may share your feedback about this program through email at airnsdtalks@gmail.com or WhatsApp on 928 909 4044.